So thank you for joining us. Speak up, Louise. I'm Louise Kenny. I'm on the special events team. So this is one of our special events. As they know, we have tours. Bill, you can't walk that way. Yes, turn it on.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Louise Kenny, and I'm on the special events team. And on special events, we have presentations like this on a Monday, and then we also run tours and one-time events out in the community, both in Northern Virginia and in Washington. So I'm happy to present this topic today. We do try to have a combination of light topics and heavier topics. This might be in the category of heavier topics, but it's such a timely topic, and we have somebody presenting to us, Marc Koblentz, who really knows his stuff in terms of this. Colonel Koblentz is a former military lawyer. He was a military lawyer for about 20 years, and then he moved over to the domestic side, and he's a civilian lawyer for about 4 or 5 years. What he did there was to coordinate the system, worked on the system, coordinated lawful transfers of military resources and support to civilian law. So he was involved with that transition. He drafted legal reviews and advised commanders on the legality and appropriateness of such support. So it's the fine line that we're talking about here, what's going on, and it ultimately is illegal. Before I transferred this over to Colonel Koblentz, I did want to remind you that we have other events coming up. The next two coming up are also fairly heavy because we're in a kind of heavy period in the country. Presidential powers, are they still limited today? Which is, of course, very timely. And then later on in August, we have a presentation about misinformation, how to identify it, and what to do about it. So again, good topics coming up. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Colonel Koblentz, also known as Marc.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? No, that's no.
Yeah.
How about now? The thing is on. So, thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Marc. Please call me that. I'm glad that you're here today. I'm glad the Zoom audience is with us as well. And I appreciate the invitation to speak today. Thank you so much. So, before we begin, well, let me just get my slides. Sure that works. Okay. Before we begin, I want to start out standard, attorneys always have to have disclaimers, right? So as you can see, I'm not in a formal suit and tie today. I'm not representing the U.S. government. I am a retired military officer. I'm a civilian. I'm speaking for myself and use just Marc's views. I'm not attributable to DOD, DHS, or the Air Force or the National Guard. So please keep that in mind. I'm going to go through what I think is an important topic. And I'm very, very happy to take questions. But I would ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to please keep the questions to the end so we don't get too derailed if there's anything kind of off topic. Then I'm very happy to have a free and open discussion about things towards the end. Another thing I want to note is that my goal today is not to convince you of anything. And I'm not looking to reach the end of this presentation, have everyone applaud politely and nod and say, yep, we agree with everything Marc said. If that happens, I will have failed in my mission to you. What I would rather have happen is that we have a lively debate, that we have disagreements, that you have your opinion and I have my opinion. We can discuss those. So I'm not trying to change your mind. All I'm trying to do here is to provide a viewpoint and some background to that and have us consider that and have us discuss that. So I'd rather hear questions that indicate maybe you disagree with me. That's fine. At least that way I know you've been paying attention. Okay, let's start out with a pretest. You don't have to answer this is rhetorical. But you look at these two images. Which one is the cop? Which one is the soldier? This should not be too hard. It should be readily apparent to anyone who's ever seen a police officer or a soldier, right? And so you think about that and you think, okay, that's easy. What is this guy up here talking about, the militarization of law enforcement? So we're going to get into why this is a topic and why you ought to care about it. Now I want to start by showing you a video. This video is from 2014, CBS Evening News, and it's about the law enforcement response to the protest that happened in Ferguson after the death of George Floyd. Now, I'm showing you this not because I want to talk about the death of George Floyd. That's a controversial topic, which is a topic of another presentation being given by somebody else at some other time that does not involve me. The reason I want to show you this video is it's going to talk about the way that the law enforcement, the civilian police department, responded to the protest that occurred after that incident. And as you watch it, it's 1 minute and 59 seconds. Hopefully that time won't be used against me. And it's going to talk about why and how the law enforcement used military hardware. And take a look at that, and then we'll talk about it. Let me see how I get this to. Oops. Okay, I may need to call a friend to do it.
Back click. Okay, now
I guess the mouse.
you can do that.
Okay.
Now let us show you another picture of those protests which are continuing this evening. You may have noticed the military vehicles in last night's footage. Well, today, Attorney General Eric Holder said he is concerned about the message that police send when they use military equipment to deal with protesters. We asked our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, to look into this.
It looks like a war zone. Tanks, combat gear, assault rifles. Police departments in the St. Louis area, like those across the country, are arming their officers with equipment once on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, much of it free of charge from the Pentagon or bought with grant money from Congress. In Neenah, Wisconsin, officers use a multi-terrain vehicle. The Boise, Idaho Police Department has an MRAP vehicle designed to withstand roadside bombs. So does the Warren County Sheriff's Department in upstate New York. Bud York is sheriff.
I'm hoping I never have to use this vehicle, but if I do have to use it, I'm not going to have to worry about my people or possibly the public being injured, because it certainly can save them.
According to one report, the federal government has doled out more than $34 billion to local police departments since the September 11th terrorist attacks for military-style equipment.
To me, this doesn't look like America.
The Cato Institute's Walter Olson says the military gear can actually incite more violence.
Some in the crowd might get more violent if they believe, wait a minute, this isn't my neighbor who's a policeman. This is a completely alien force that I have nothing in common with because they're coming at me with an armored vehicle.
Now, law enforcement in St. Louis County have gotten more than $500,000 worth of military equipment from the Pentagon, including 7 Humvees and a dozen M16s. But Scott, a congressman here in Washington today, is proposing legislation that would scale back that military equipment program for local police.
Jan, thanks very much.
Okay, so that was from 2014. As you can imagine, the amount of military equipment and the dollar value has increased dramatically.
Now let us show you another picture of those protests which are continuing this evening.
Okay. So, as you can imagine, in the ensuing 12 years, the amount of military equipment, the dollar value of military equipment that's gone to civilian police departments has increased dramatically. This is 12 years old. But I show it to you because I wanted to have that background. And I want to ask you to think about this. Why do we care? What's the big deal? You kind of saw both viewpoints a little bit in the video. So it's a matter of public trust. When you see this military equipment being used by the civilian police in your community, what do you think about that? Does it make you thankful and think to yourself, well, thank gosh, if they have that, I feel safe? Or does it make you feel apprehensive and wondering why they're using it? And is it appropriate for the scenario? And is it going to be used in an inappropriate way against civilians here in the United States? It's a matter of officer safety. The police want to make sure that their officers are protected. They don't get injured in the line of duty. The military equipment can help with that. It's a matter of constitutional legitimacy. The military has one job, which does not deal very much with constitutional legitimacy and civil liberties. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's not as much their focus as the police. Police have to deal with that all the time. As I'm going through this, sorry. So, as we talk about this, think about what you've seen in your community, think about what you see on the news in other communities. You look at these guys, these police officers, and you ask these questions about why they have this hardware, how they received it, is it legal, is it appropriate, and what are your concerns? Why do these police officers look like they're about to invade Poland? Think about that. And a lot of people think, well, maybe it's not legal, maybe they're doing something wrong. But by the end of today, I want you to understand that the primary concern is not legality, because in most cases, this is procured, acquired by the police departments legally, inappropriately, following the law, but it's how they use it and when they use it. It's the culture of the use that becomes the real issue, and that's going to be my focus. Now, these are rhetorical questions. You don't really need to raise your hand if you don't want to. But think about, and there's a lot of misconceptions about this. Can the military generally assist the police? Can the military assist the police? Can the military actually act like police out in our civilian society? Is police use of military equipment generally legal or not legal? Is it generally appropriate or not appropriate? Has American policing become too militarized? And what does that mean, too militarized? You see the hardware that they use, the uniforms that they sometimes wear, the tactics, training that they use and sometimes receive. Has American military policing become too militarized, or is it just right, or maybe even not enough? Opinions can vary. You may have heard of the Posse Comitatus Act. That's a federal statute, and I'll talk about that and define that in a little while, that talks about restrictions on what the military can and, more importantly, cannot do when it comes to law enforcement in this country. And explaining that, being able to understand what that means and explaining it is important, and I'll get there in a couple slides. So I'm talking about this topic of the militarization of civilian law enforcement. Let's define what that means. Taking a look at the headings in the circle there, think about the job, the mission of the military versus the police. I spent 24.5 years in uniform in the U.S. Air Force. Our mission, when you boil it down, is that we kill people and break things. We do lots of other stuff too, but in combat against an enemy overseas, that's what we do. The police serve and protect. That's a different mission, different priorities. And it requires a different approach, a different tactic, different training. And so when law enforcement, civilian law enforcement is using military equipment, sometimes that line is blurred. And that's where sometimes the problems arise. Again, culturally, how it's used, not necessarily legally, whether or not they can do it, but should they do it? And that's a question that you need to ask. As we go through this, I want to talk about two different flavors or sides of the same coin. First, in orange on the left, you've got the military support to civilian law enforcement. What this means is how the military might help law enforcement from time to time. On the right, in green, you've got the provision of military resources to law enforcement. That's not the military helping the police, that's the military giving or selling hardware to the police for the police to use and keep for themselves. This is important to understand the distinction. I'm going to talk about both and the issues involved with them. So again, with the military support to civilian law enforcement, this is where the military gives help, lends equipment, lends resources, lends personnel, lends training, lends capability, but it's temporary. The military retains control. But when that happens, because it's the military doing it, military in a federal status, they are subject to the restrictions on law enforcement in the Posse Comitatus Act. On the other hand, when the military is giving, granting, or selling equipment to civilian law enforcement, then that's not temporary, that's permanent. Now the civilian police departments own it. They command it, they control it, they use it, they operate it. Once the transfer happens, the military is out of the picture. So therefore, it's the police doing it, and it's not subject to any of the restrictions in the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, in the audience today is a friend of mine, Deputy Police Chief Dave Giroux of the Arlington County PD. And Chief, I appreciate your being here. Thank you. Chief Giroux is a friend of mine. We had a conversation the other day about this. He gave me an example of right here in the county how the police use military hardware in a perfectly legal and appropriate way. And I'll make a confession here. If I were in his shoes, I'd want to have military equipment in my department as well. It's very, very useful in a lot of ways. It helps force protection, officer safety. It helps in terms of leveling the playing field because oftentimes these days, the bad guys might be better armed than the cops. It may help intimidate, whether that's a good thing or not, we can debate. It's highly effective in solving things with a kinetic approach, and sometimes that's necessary. Does it deter crime? Maybe, maybe not. But I'm going to relate to you a story that Chief Giroux shared with me the other day. So right here in Arlington County, about a mile and a half from the room that we're sitting in today, right now, along the Bluemont Trail near the intersection of Wilson Boulevard and George Mason, there was an incident where people on the trail observed there's a bunch of single-family homes there, of someone leaning out the window of one of these homes shooting a flare gun out into the air. And that's pretty concerning. I see a couple of people nodding. That's a concern, right? So they called the police. And so the police responded, and they were unable to make contact with the individual. The individual did not stop doing this, and that became a bigger concern. Then they heard gunfire inside the home. That became an even bigger concern, so they elevated their response. And since they were unable to talk to the guy inside, one thing that they did was they brought along a piece of equipment called a Bearcat. It's a military-style piece of hardware, which is basically an armored vehicle. And they had police officers inside the armored vehicle. They were able to drive it up to the door of the house, and they used an apparatus on the outside of it to basically knock on and punch down the door so they can access the individual inside. They were worried about gunfire. That's why they were in this armored vehicle, this military-style Bearcat. What happened next was that the house exploded. Now think about this. If those police officers had been on foot, if they had been in a civilian police cruiser, they'd probably be dead or at least maimed. Because they were in that military-style armored Bearcat, those police officers are fine. They were uninjured, and they were able to continue on the job. That is a perfectly legal, perfectly appropriate police use of military hardware in our community 2 or 3 years ago, a mile and a half from where I'm standing right now. And Chief, I appreciate you sharing that story with me. Now, we can talk about lots of other examples on both sides of the issue, where it was legal and appropriate, and maybe in other contexts where it very much was not appropriate, and it raises lots of questions and controversy. So the problem, as I said, it's not, generally speaking, a legal problem. The problem is cultural. It's how stuff is used. And it's a balancing act. So many things we have to make priority choices and have to decide what we want to pursue. And between law and security and liberty, they're all good policy things that we want to promote and pursue. In this circumstance, we can generally get to 2 of them pretty easily. Getting to all 3 is the challenge. You can pretty much choose any 2 of those and you can achieve it. But achieving all 3 in balance is the real challenge. And that's what I'm wanting us to talk about today. Now, in the video, you heard about some of the equipment that the police in and around Ferguson and other communities were using. And one of those things was called an MRAP. Here's another picture of an MRAP. Now, in the military, everything is an acronym, everything. So an MRAP is a mine-resistant, landmine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle. It's armored, obviously. It's huge. It'll run over pretty much anything in its path. And it'll keep the personnel inside safe from landmines and all that sort of explosions. So what assumptions come with this vehicle when it's in the hands of your local police department? What attitudes do police have when they're using this equipment? And the reason I chose this picture disturbs me not because of the MRAP. I have no issue with the MRAP at all. What disturbs me about the picture is the look on the faces of those 2 police officers. And I see some people nodding in agreement. So what are they so proud of? What are they so excited about? It's an inanimate object. It's a piece of gear. They look awfully darn proud about having that. They look awfully psyched to use it, don't they? What does that lead us to wonder and question about their frame of mind with regards to having and potentially using this equipment? Because they're not soldiers. And the military gear doesn't make the cop into a soldier any more than giving me a scalpel would make me into a surgeon. Anyone want me to operate on them? They didn't teach me that in law school. And the Air Force didn't teach me that either. So you have a situation where you've got a phenomenal capability designed to withstand landmines. Have you ever heard of the local police chasing a bad guy through a minefield? Now, there are other uses for this as well, and we can talk about that. So sometimes it is perfectly legitimate and appropriate for the law enforcement to use a vehicle like this, but sometimes not. And my fear as I look at the faces of these 2 officers is that what they have in mind might not be all that appropriate. And my fear also is that there's a marketing aspect to this, and police are not immune from this, just like the military is not immune to this. So many things today are marketed as military grade, and a lot of people, particularly those who have not served in the military, Like military grade, that must be the strongest, best stuff out there. Can we get some of that? And you look at commercials you see on TV, you look through Amazon, and you see products where it talks about military grade. And the helicopter, yeah, that's an awfully unique military item, an attack helicopter. It's military grade. But I can tell you, after 24 and a half years of uniform experience, military grade generally means it's supplied by the lowest bidder. It doesn't mean it's any great indicia of quality. And military gear breaks all the time. It might be a tactical solution to a budget service if there's ever a police department that has the money. So look at some of these things. You've got military grade coffee mugs and pens and flashlights. You've got a military grade tactical diaper bin. I'm a father. I've got a 6-year-old at home. Wasn't all that many years ago that I had to change her diaper. And sometimes I had some pretty challenging circumstances where I had to change a diaper when I was away from the house out in public. But as challenging as those had been, I never needed a tactical military grade diaper bin. There were times I could have used a hazmat suit, but that's another question. Now, we talked earlier about the Ferguson response. And you remember that there was a lot of controversy about the Ferguson response because the police came in with these armored vehicles, these tactical military-style vehicles, in order to handle civilian protests, civil disturbances by a public that was upset because of the circumstances in which George Floyd died. And a lot of folks felt that the police response using that military hardware for those protests in the streets of Ferguson was inappropriate, heavy-handed. On the other hand, remember in Boston, the Boston Marathon bombing, you had a couple of terrorists who exploded a device near the finish line of the Boston Marathon during the race. Killed lots of people, injured lots of people. Then they fled, and there was a huge police response, and they chased these guys through the streets and suburbs in and around Boston. And the manhunt went on for a while, and during that manhunt, these terrorists committed other crimes, including murder, as they were trying to get away and elude the police. And finally, the police did catch them in some suburb of Boston, pulled up in the backyard of a home, in a shed or something. And you see the picture here on the right, where the police responded with similar gear to what was used in Ferguson, but they used it in a very different way. Whereas in Ferguson, arguably, the police were using it to intimidate and to have an overreaction or an overkill response to civilian protests. In Boston, the police used it to protect their officers because they knew that they were chasing down guys who had no problem killing police officers and other civilians. So they were using it to protect themselves. Same piece of gear, same equipment, different use. Which one's appropriate and worries you? Which one's not appropriate and maybe you're even thankful for? Think about that. It's all about culture and context and use. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we got to this point. Police departments have been using military gear for a long time. How did we get here? During World War II, the military swelled enormously to fight that war. And when World War II ended, the military suddenly had an enormous amount of excess hardware, all kinds of things, jeeps and trucks and ammo and weapons and you name it. So they had a lot of extra stuff that they needed to get rid of. And then as you went fast forward a couple more years into the 60s and 70s, this is the Vietnam era, this is the civil rights era, lots of protests, lots of demonstrations, lots of civil disturbances. The police had a new thing that they needed to deal with that they didn't have that much to deal with previously in terms of civil unrest. And they found that all this excess military hardware that they were able to get from the federal government was useful in some contexts and maybe inappropriately so in some contexts in dealing with those civil protests and demonstrations and whatnot. And then they had a new threat after 9/11. Now suddenly, suburban, urban, city, municipal police departments in this country had to deal with terror threats that they didn't really have to deal with or think about much before 9/11. And so the military and the police departments developed a process through which they could access military hardware, either sold to them or granted to them, given to them, donated to them, in order for them to use it in a law enforcement context. That's how we got here. Now, remember I said earlier, there's the distinction to make between military support, military helping the police, and the provision of military stuff to the police, military giving or selling stuff to the police. I'll talk about the military support first, and then I'll talk about the provision of military equipment second. So with regard to military support to civilian law enforcement, we've got three main legal topics to cover. And I'm going to only cover the wave tops. I'm not going to get into a deep dive because I don't want to have to charge you $500 now. First of all, you have National Guard domestic operations. I'll talk about that with you. Then you have the Posse Comitatus Act, which I already mentioned, and I'll talk to you about some of the details of what that federal statute entails. Then you have the Insurrection, which is another federal statute, and I'll talk about what that is or what it means. You may have heard a lot about the Insurrection Act in the news very recently. Chat about that as well. So the National Guard first. In the National Guard, you say it's all about status. Now, the chart maybe is confusing. The one takeaway I want you to have from the chart, the only foot stomp from this chart, the bottom line is that the Posse Comitatus Act, the restrictions I'll talk about in a few minutes for what the military can and cannot do in a law enforcement context, only applies when the National Guard is in Title 10 federal status. This is when the president calls up the National Guard to augment and become part of the regular Air Force and regular Army, mostly to do combatant activities against an enemy overseas. Sure. And in that situation, PCA, as we call it, the Posse Comitatus Act, applies. All the other contexts where the National Guard is employed in the other statuses, Title 32 and State Active Duty, which is SAD, Posse Comitatus Act does not apply, meaning it does not restrict what the National Guard in those non-federal statuses, those state statuses, what they can and cannot do in terms of policing the local populace. That's the basic takeaway. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act, we call it the PCA. After the Civil War, the 1860s thereabouts, you had Congress that was concerned in the aftermath of the Civil War that they wanted the standing army to be available to fight the enemy should another enemy arise. But they didn't want the military to become America's sheriff. Think about that. Congress did not want the military to become America's sheriff. So they drafted the statute called the Posse Comitatus Act. That's Latin. Don't worry about what it literally means. But basically, it gave restrictions and put restrictions on what the military in its federal status could and more importantly could not do when engaged with law enforcement out amongst the citizens in our domestic communities. And it's a federal statute. It's under Title 18 of the Federal Code. And it basically says the military can't enforce domestic laws unless expressly allowed by the Constitution or expressly allowed by Congress. So, two big exceptions. Why? Because they figured if the Constitution allows something, or if we, Congress, decide that that should be allowable, then that would be allowed. And so, two of the exceptions that I want to mention to you, one is called the military purpose. The military purpose doctrine simply means that if the military has a reason to do some law enforcement in order to accomplish its military mission, that's okay. I'll give you a very, very simple example. Let's say the military's got a convoy of stuff going from base A to base B. They need to get it there over the civilian roads, and it needs to get there by a certain time. So they're going to load it up with a bunch of soldiers and put it on military trucks and convoy it over. If they reach a point where there's too much traffic, not going to be able to get on time, and their mission, national security, requires that they get there on time, they can act as a law enforcement agent. They can move the traffic out of the way. They can say, hey, stop, even though you're on a lawful road and you're not doing anything wrong, driver, you need to stop and let us through. That's a military purpose, even though it's subjecting the civilians to the military's enforcement of the law. That's a military purpose and it's allowed to happen. That's the military purpose doctrine, very simple. The other big exception is the Insurrection Act. And under the Insurrection Act, if invoked by the president, then the Posse Comitatus Act goes out the window. We'll talk about the Insurrection Act in just a few moments. And again, remember, Posse Comitatus also does not apply to the military when it's National Guard in non-federal status. So when the National Guard is in its state status, it can enforce state laws subject to any state restrictions in the state constitution of the state laws. That's all that means. Now, as we talk about this, you hear a lot of things suggesting that the military, because of the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act, needs to exercise restraint. I'll let you in on a little secret. I know Hollywood sometimes depicts the military as a bunch of trigger-pulling, trigger-happy guys, eager to fight, wanting to go to war, snake eaters, all that sort of thing. It's just Hollywood. It's not true. Military folks don't want to die any more than you and I want. Military exercises and practices and teaches restraint all the time. It's a great irony. The military is the most powerful offensive force in the world, and they spend more time teaching you when not to pull the trigger than when you should pull the trigger. I often did that teaching many times. And many times I have spent in my career advising troops and advising commanders at the highest level about when they should not use force, even though it would be lawful under international law and under domestic law. Even when it would be lawful to use force, they shouldn't do it because not of a legal problem, but because it's not appropriate. It's against what our policy ought to be. We practice that restraint, we teach that restraint all the time. The image here is of a military court-martial, which is a military felony trial. Just like a civilian trial, when someone in the military does something illegal, we can prosecute them. And there's all these things that I want to talk to you about for a minute that form the basis of why and how we would hold people accountable in that manner. We have rules of engagement. That's called ROE. Rules of engagement are a set of rules, not laws, mind you, just rules that commanders make up in order to govern how their troops conduct themselves when they're using force overseas in a combat situation against an enemy combatant. So things that they would otherwise lawfully be allowed to do, ROE says, don't want you doing that. So they can better control their forces during combat operations. We have rules on the use of force, RUF, which are very similar, but they apply not in an overseas combat context, but rather in a domestic law enforcement context. When the military is going to use force lawfully here in the United States against our civilian population, there are rules on the use of force to govern what they might not do, even if it would be lawful, what the commanders don't want them doing. Again, to better control the domestic military operations so it doesn't get out of hand. We have rules about the escalation of force. When you think about the force continuum, you have everything from yelling at a guy, stop, freeze, put down a weapon, to using deadly force. That's a continuum from the lowest level of force up to the highest level of force. And we teach how they start at a lower level, appropriate to the scenario, and then escalate the use of force under a certain way if and when it's necessary. And we teach that so that the cops, so that the military do not automatically resort to deadly force immediately just because they got someone jaywalking. The police, Chief Giroux, correct me if I'm wrong, you do something very similar, right? For those on Zoom, he's nodding yes. We have accountability. We hold our folks accountable. We have concept of lawful orders and unlawful orders. We teach that lawful orders, you've got a duty and obligation to obey, and unlawful orders, you have a duty and an obligation not to obey. And we teach them how to determine if something is a lawful order or not a lawful or unlawful. We spend a lot of time on it. That's in the news these days, isn't it? I'm happy to address questions about that later. And we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, which is Federal Military Code, Criminal Code, which we enforce with courts-martial, those felony trials. So if a soldier, a sailor, an airman, a marine, a guardian, a coast guard, personnel, a National Guardsman, under federal status, if they violate an article of the UCMJ, they can be investigated, charged, prosecuted, they can defend themselves, and if convicted, they can be sentenced, just like a civilian trial. We have all that process in those rules, and we teach all that restraint to ensure that when our personnel, who wield an enormous amount of firepower, an enormous amount of force potentially, don't use it inappropriately. That's the point of all that. The police have something similar, but there are some differences. And my point today is that when they're using military hardware, it's particularly important that they exercise restraint and have accountability so that they use it properly. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the insurrection. This is the major exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. This is where the president can invoke this federal statute, the Insurrection Act. And by invoking it, the president can allow military to be used domestically, can act as America's sheriff. This is a rarely used authority. The last time it was used was in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots in the immediate aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. You might remember that. Hasn't really been used since. Lately, it's been in the news a lot because the president keeps on threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act. We can talk about that. But again, the point here is that if it's invoked or when it's invoked, it allows the president to use the federal military, including National Guard and federal status, under the president's command and control to enforce the laws amongst the states. If you think about that and think about how you feel about that, maybe you're a big fan, maybe that worries you. It worries a lot of people, and that's why it's a controversial topic. And it depends on the circumstances under which it would be used. Some circumstances, maybe it's not very controversial. Maybe people would think, yeah, that's necessary. But in many scenarios, in many circumstances, people will think, maybe it's not so appropriate. Maybe that worries us. Maybe that shouldn't be happening. Now, all this has been talking about military support to law enforcement. Now I want to turn the page and talk about the military provision of resources to civilian law enforcement. This is where police departments acquire for keeps this military hardware. The acquisition is highly regulated. Anytime you're doing anything with the military and the federal government, it's highly regulated. The use of it, once the police departments get their hands on it, not so uniformly regulated. Maybe that's where some of the problems. So first, let's talk a little bit about authorities. And again, trying to avoid charging you and billing you for this legal services. I won't get too much into the weeds. There's something called the 1033 program. That's a federal statute under Title 10 where it basically lays out how police departments can get military hardware from the military for free. It's transferred, it's donated. Now, Chief Juro, are police chiefs interested when someone says, I'm going to give you equipment for free?
Yes.
Yes, they are. Why wouldn't they be? Very, very motivating for local police departments. There's also a program called surplus military sales, where the military would sell it to police departments. And there's something called general support to civilian agencies, which is, again, another way that hardware can get into the hands of police departments. So following through these authorities, assuming that they do all the paperwork correctly, it's all legal. There's no legal concern or problem with any of this acquisition. The key is in the details of the use of the law enforcement utilizes the equipment once they have it. What can they get? All kinds of stuff. There's a smorgasbord, hardware, tactics, training. So hardware is guns, ammo, vehicles, armored, MRAPs, things like that. Tactics. The military will teach the police how to use certain tactics that they may have acquired and developed from things like urban warfare, which may be useful when the police have to hunt down bad guys in urban environments, as one example. Training. The military can be contracted or even gives it for free. Not really contracted because they don't sell it for the highest bidder, but they provide training directly to police departments. That's part of this program. So all kinds of training on how to use the equipment that the police departments are getting from the military. These pieces of equipment sometimes are not easy to use, so we'll not only give it to the law enforcement departments, but we'll train them on how to use it. So really, you don't need to worry about what the police have. You need to worry about how they're using it, when they're using it, and are they using it appropriately. Distinguish between the job of a soldier, defeating armed enemy combatants, breaking things and killing people in a combatant situation overseas with an enemy force, against the police mission here in the United States, protecting constitutional order, civil liberties to serve and protect. Think about those different contexts, those different missions, and both organizations using some similar equipment to accomplish it. Capability is not mission. So if you have a shiny hammer, a shiny brand new hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail, doesn't it? But not every problem is a nail that can be solved with the use of your shiny new hammer. And so you need to make sure that just because you have the capability of doing something, you have a certain piece of hardware that has certain capabilities, doesn't mean that's the answer to all of your law enforcement problems and challenges. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. So that's what police departments and officers need to understand. They're designed for different purposes, and if the purpose is analogous to what the law enforcement needs, as the situation happened off the Blue Mont Trail that I told you about that Chief Churro shared with me the other day, that was a great example of an appropriate use of the shiny new hammer because the problem was a nail. But many times it's a different problem, and that shiny new hammer, that piece of military equipment, might not be the best tool for the job. Maybe you should stay in the garage or back at headquarters and use some other law enforcement tool that they already have and know how to use. That's the key, to know the difference and use the right piece of gear. So we're talking about culture. We have to ask ourselves why the culture changes. And you think about this. Many civilian police are veterans, military veterans, many of them. And many have combat experience recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've used this military before, they've used this military hardware before when they were in military uniform, in combat. And that may blur the mental switch in their minds between overseas combat use and domestic policing. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying veterans make bad police officers, not at all. And I think Chief Churro would probably agree with me, as I think many of his peers would, that many, many times veterans make outstanding police officers. He's nodding yes. But they also bring their experiences with them, and sometimes might have a hard time turning that part of their mind off when they're in a new context and a new profession. Both the military and the police swear oaths. They're different oaths, but they're very similar in a lot of respects. And they take that oath seriously. There's a professionalism about it. And so when someone amongst their ranks violates that oath by doing something wrong, the military is very disappointed with that soldier who does that, and likewise, the police are very disappointed with that officer who violates their oath by doing something illegal or inappropriate. So the point here is not that I think military makes bad cops. The point is that in both professions, in every profession, there are certain norms and habits and assumptions that make work perfectly well in the first profession, but maybe don't translate over as well into the second one. That's what all police, just like all soldiers and everyone else, have to keep in mind. So my point here in all of this is to talk about why use discipline matters. Use discipline simply means how the police are using the equipment that they've lawfully acquired and appropriately acquired, how they use it in a lawful and appropriate way. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they might lack sufficient training in the civilian law enforcement use of that equipment. They might lack the sufficient mindset about protecting civil liberties. We've seen this on the news. You saw that perhaps in Ferguson. Well, lots of rules about how they get the equipment, but not so many rules that varies from police department to police department about how they use the equipment. And although the individual provision of a military resource could be perfectly legal and perfectly appropriate, in the aggregate, it could develop into a problem. That's the dynamic to understand. So what are we going to do about it? A couple ideas. It's very, very easy to get up here and talk about the problems, right? But I don't want to just talk about problems. I want to advocate for some of those solutions, try to actually help. I remember a long time ago when I was a very junior officer, and I went to my commander, the problem. The commander looked at me, I was a lieutenant at the time, and they said, Lieutenant, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And that stuck with me, and I always tried to train myself since then that when I go into the commander, the problem, I bring in a proposed solution or three to choose from and to advocate so that I'm not becoming part of the problem, I'm helping the commander solve the problem. So to that end, what do we do about this? Well, first of all, I think we need to strengthen use discipline. When and how to use the equipment, when not to use the equipment. Just like the military practices, teaching restraint all the time. I know many police departments do the same, but some maybe not as much. And I would dare say that that earlier slide with those two police from the MRAP and those huge grins that they had pointing to that thing, maybe those officers don't have great use discipline. Maybe they don't have great training. I would propose increased end-use monitoring. If any of you have ever worked with the State Department, they have a program in which they have foreign military sales. This is where the State Department is allowed to sell military hardware, weaponry, aircraft, guns, tanks, ships to allied foreign countries for them to use in their military. And when the State Department does that, they have this program called end-use monitoring, whereby they attach conditions to the provision, sale, or granting of this equipment to the other country. One of my assignments in the military was in Saudi Arabia at a place called Escon Village, where there's a command called the U.S. Military Training Mission. Basically, we were gun runners to the Saudis. We did foreign military sales to the Saudis. It was the attorney there advising the commander. And so I learned about this end-use monitoring, where we attach these conditions that if the country receiving our hardware, our ships, our planes, whatever, misused it, violating the conditions, then we would either take it back or we cut them off of foreign military sales in the future, that sort of thing. There are consequences. Maybe we need more of that, because here's the irony. Right now, when the military gives hardware to a local police department in the United States, that local police department faces less conditions and restrictions and monitoring from military than foreign countries do when they get military hardware from the Department of State. Is that crazy? Maybe we need more something like end-use monitoring. Maybe increased consequences for the misuse of this equipment, not just for the individual cop on a beat on the street, but for the police commanders higher up the chain. When you have in the military, responsibility goes all the way up the chain. And I know the police is built the same way. They've got a chain of command as well. So if you, again, make sure you not only hold accountable the individual officer, but up the chain for the people responsible for fielding that equipment and training its use. Maybe more training and better training for civilian use of the law enforcement equipment from the military, maybe more transparency. So, we have a great example from Wellington County, but wouldn't it be great if there was greater transparency across all communities about how their local police departments, what equipment they have and what circumstances are going to use it and when they're not going to use it? That might be a good thing. And maybe in some areas it exists, maybe not enough. So as we look at all this, what do we want? I would propose we want every society wants our police to be capable to respond to extraordinary threats, to be protected and safe when they do so. That's what we want for the police. We want police to remember that they serve citizens, not enemies in a combat scene. The challenge is to preserve both, not have one sacrificed in service of the other. A lot of times in the military, I advise commanders when they asked during a military operation, they wanted to know if they could use a certain capability. And oftentimes that capability was perfectly legal. But I may advise them, sir, man, it's legal, but maybe you shouldn't do it anyway because some other consideration, a policy consideration, an appropriateness consideration. And that often gave them pause, and more times than not, they would agree after we talked about that. So the issue isn't can we, but should we? And the police can obviously have that same type of conversation because you know what? The MRAP is not the problem. The MRAP does not violate civil liberties. The MRAP doesn't violate your rights. MRAP in and of itself doesn't do anything. People do things. Police officers do things. Soldiers do things, right? So the MRAP is a tool like that shiny hammer. So the debate should not be about the equipment. It should be about the institutional culture surrounding how that equipment is used. So if you leave today believing that police should have access to extraordinary capabilities, but that those capabilities also require the police to exercise extraordinary discipline, then you've understood my argument. Now, I'm an attorney, so I have to have a disclaimer. And I talk fast. I'm from New Jersey. I'm a lawyer. That's what I do. But I want to make sure you leave a lot of time for questions. I'm very, very happy to take all your questions. But before we do that, I want to give you your final exam. So the final exam, you remember the pre-exam. We have the cop and the soldier. Now again, we have a cop and a soldier. Which one's the cop? If you're not sure, if you think you're sure, but there's a little bit of doubt in your mind, then you understand what we've been talking about. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
You have any questions?
And if there's not questions, I'm not afraid to call them. And
Just hold on for a minute. How does ICE fit into this?
I was wondering,
The question was for the Zoom folks, how does ICE fit into all of this?
I was wondering in my mind how many questions would happen before ICE came up. The answer was none. So how does ICE fit into this? ICE is a law enforcement agency It's a component of the Department of Homeland Security, and they have a law enforcement mission. And so they use military hardware like many other different law enforcement agencies use military hardware. Question is, why does ICE use their military hardware in the manner that they use it? And is it appropriate? And in ICE's case, you have to ask, is it legal? Now, opinions can differ on this. You know, your mileage may vary. I think that an awful lot of folks have a lot of concerns, obviously, about how ICE is using its military equipment and why they use it in that manner. But it fits under the same rules as the Arlington County PD or any other law enforcement agency that we might talk about. Same rules, same issue, same cultural problem. I think that in ICE, you have a lot of folks who maybe were prior military, maybe have that combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe not have sufficient training on the civilian use of some of that equipment, and maybe don't have that mental clarity between distinguishing I'm in combat overseas under rules of engagement, or I'm here in the United States doing civilian law enforcement under rules of the use of force and how they apply that. I think there's errors being made there. And unlike enemies who can sue the military, who cannot sue the military, excuse me, unlike enemies overseas, combatant enemies who can't sue us over the war in a court in the same manner, if civilian people in this country are doing something and ICE responds in a way that's illegal and inappropriate, they have recourse. And some of those cases are going to be making their way through, and we'll see what happens. There's also recourse in the court of public opinion. We're seeing a lot of that in this way.
Yeah, why is there not requirement for the type of training they should have, which seems to me to be the military type?
So, do you want to repeat it?
Why don't you repeat it? What are the requirements, and should they be greater, to have training? The ICE people having the requisite training, perhaps like the military does.
So I'll answer the question backwards. The second part of your question was, should they? The answer is yes. Of course they should. What are the requirements? So those will vary from law enforcement agency to law enforcement agency. The military can provide training depending on what the equipment is, and with some equipment, there is training that comes with it, and some there's not. So it really depends on the factual eaches of every single circumstance. It's kind of hard to generalize with all of that. But to your point, you're absolutely correct, in my opinion, that there should be training when they're using lethal equipment. That in many law enforcement agencies, there is that training, and that it appears from the outside looking at it that maybe ICE is either not doing the sufficient training, or if they are, maybe the folks working there aren't absorbing it based on what we're seeing. So although I was working at Homeland Security after I retired from the Air Force, I don't have any current direct insight into how ICE is doing this. I see the same news as you, and I'm very concerned.
Do we have some questions online, Laura?
Yes. See, microphone working now. I will talk loudly. Dennis asked, isn't much of this a function of post-Iraq Afghanistan equipment, which is no longer any use for the U.S. military? In short, the military is awash in useless equipment.
So although a lot of this does stem from excess military hardware from those wars, I would not agree that it's useless to the military now that those wars are no longer happening. Military equipment, some of it has a shelf life, some of it does not. A lot of it can be used for all sorts of missions, including the training of our own force. So I do think that military equipment in many respects has ongoing usefulness for the military. However, the military makes the determination of which pieces of hardware are excess that they can give up to the civilian law enforcement agencies. And obviously, if the military wants to hang on to something because they have a use for it, they don't offer it to the police. So I guess that's how I would answer.
Second question, Patricia asks, does the military have an exit program to diffuse the mindset before the person re-enters the civilian world and takes up a civilian job, including one with a police force?
So the military does have transition programs for any personnel who's getting out of the service and going to the civilian workforce. We don't always know which individuals are going to specifically seek jobs with law enforcement agencies on the civilian side. And sometimes they don't know that themselves until they're already out. I don't think that there's any kind of a reverse brainwashing, if you will, any kind of a mental debriefing of their attitudes. That's pretty hard. And I guess I would defer to medical professionals about if that's even possible. But to the concern about whether or not military personnel getting out of uniform are adequately taught how to turn off that part of their mind when they go into a place, I think, again, Chief Giroux, please correct me if you disagree, and you're welcome to disagree. I think a lot of that responsibility rests with the civilian police department that might be hiring the veteran to make sure that before they hire this person, that they understand that they, the person to be hired as a police officer, understands they're no longer in the Army. Do you agree with that?
I would concur with that, and most, I obviously speak for Arlington. Yeah, I would say I do concur with that, and I think I obviously can speak for Arlington with the most knowledge, but almost every agency that I know, particularly in this region, which has very high standards, the hiring process involves a variety of screenings, right? There's a panel interview, there's a basic background screen for prior criminal behavior and traffic violations, and shit. But we also have a psychological screening process. We have a medical screening process, and we have a polygraph, or what's commonly called a lie detector test. So they have to pass all of those things before they get hired. And we hire roughly 2% of the people who apply to become police officers. Roughly 2% of them actually make it through the entire process and get hired. So it's a very selective process. I know when I got hired, that was in the mid 90s, so we had more applicants than we do now, but they had 1,000 applicants and they hired 11 of us.
Thank you. So now, as you know, and as we all can relate, no system is perfect. And the military recruits people, and sometimes we recruit someone that we have to take out later on because he or she didn't fit in. And I'm sure the police have that same experience. But to his point, there are processes involved to try to make sure that they're not hiring someone who thinks that they're still in the Army and that they think that people they deal with on the streets are like enemy combatants that they've dealt with overseas.
Another question from Mike. This may be a little off topic, but given the degree to which the Supreme Court has gutted Section 1983 and similar statutes, do you really believe that the threat of litigation is a meaningful deterrent to LEO misconduct?
Less so today than it was. And my message would be, don't give up the fight.
Okay. Kathy asks, how resistant is the military to changing signals are regarding ROE coming from the top political leadership? Two recent examples. The Blue Angel flyover over Pensacola, which was considered too low, and the Apache flight to Kid Rock's house. In both cases, the initial military response indicated some concern with possible misbehavior or mistakes, but in both cases, Secretary of Defense responses indicated no actions for follow-up would occur.
That's a great question.
Mark, can you repeat the question for the online folks? It's
Sure.
long, but the threat.
Sure. So the question basically for folks coming in from Zoom is the person cited the example just last week with the pilot from the Blue Angels, the Navy aerial demonstration team, flew their aircraft extremely low over a beach over the July 4th weekend, very, very low. And another example when some Army helicopter pilots flew their helicopters over Kid Rock's house, I think in Florida. And those incidents both made the news. The military chain of command initially had big concerns about those two incidents and was going to look into it. And then Secretary Hegseth said, no worries, no problems, carry on Patriots. And so the question was, first part of the question was really about, does the military still take Israel seriously in light of those? Is that basically the gist of it?
Yeah.
So here's my answer. First of all, I share the concerns about the appropriateness and legality of the very low pass over a beach with the Blue Angels and about the helicopter visits to Kid Rock's house. The military has strict rules about flyovers, about what the mission might be, where missions fly, and pilots are not supposed to deviate from those. They're well trained on this. And it's pretty clear, at least from my time in the military, it was always very, very clear what they can and cannot do, particularly with low flights over civilian populated areas, which are inherently dangerous. I am concerned, like the questioner is, about why the secretary told them no issues, no problems, carry on. I am concerned about whether the chain of command will have an ability to properly investigate these things and to hold responsible anyone who may be deemed to have done something wrong. I know when I served, the investigation would have happened, the case would have been looked at, and if the evidence was there, it would have been prosecuted without undue influence from the chain of command, including civilian leadership. Things have changed, haven't they? And I sometimes shake my head with concerns about what's going on today and why this is happening. I think the rank and file, I think the military personnel, by and large, understand the rules and want to follow them. We saw the commander of the Blue Angels squadron say something to the effect of, notwithstanding the secretary's message, he, the Blue Angels commander, was concerned about this and wanted to still look into it. And I commend that Blue Angels commander for having the integrity to do that. And I hope and think that most military personnel have that integrity and want to do the right thing.
I have a question. The issue about people not following illicit orders or unconstitutional orders, that's very lofty, but when you're in the situation and the order is to go and to proceed, and you're the guy holding up your hand saying, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about this. How does that work in reality?
It's a great question. And it's a real difficult question. Depending on the circumstances, and you can have lots of different circumstances. If you're receiving an order and you have serious doubts about the legality of that order, sometimes, if time permits, you can question it respectfully. You can go to the military judge advocate, someone like me when I was in service, and ask about it. Sometimes time does not permit. So that leaves the individual soldier, sailor, airman, marine, what have you, with the conundrum of either questioning the order, not following the order at his or her own peril, if they're wrong, or following the order at their own peril if it turned out that it was illegal, because we have ample precedent from, for example, from World War II. There's a case called Yamashita. There's another case called the My Lai case, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where the defense of I was just following orders was deemed to be not a proper authorized defense. That did not excuse or condone what you did by saying I was just following orders. So we train our military on what a lawful order is and what an unlawful order is. But that does not take away the difficulty, the pressure that our military personnel would feel if they're ever in that situation and have to question it and time doesn't really permit them to do their homework. So it's a matter of integrity at that point. I can tell you that the military training in this regard is pretty extensive. And in the 24 and a half years I served, the examples of when a lawful or questionable order were given that soldiers and sailors, et cetera, had to make that decision were incredibly rare. Incredibly rare. But they happened. They make the news when it happens. But like aircraft crashes, when a 747 crashes, it's national, if not international news. But you don't read about the 14,000 flights to take off and land safely every day, right? So it's similar to that. It's news when it happens. It happens very, very rarely. And we hope that we train the folks sufficiently to get it right. We put, like the police, we put an enormous amount of responsibility to some very young men and women. We arm them to the teeth and expect them to do the right thing. And to their great credit, in the vast majority of cases, they do the right thing. And when they don't, it makes the news.
Thank you, Mark. There you go. Going back to ICE, though, they don't do that.
Yeah, right. I mean, from what I read,
and also when you served 24, things were different when you were serving also.
That's right, man. So I retired from the Air Force in 2021. I went to work for DHS as a civilian attorney from 21, and I resigned last fall. And so now I'm a free agent now, my own. I founded a strategic advisory firm, Eagle Edge LLC. I'll get to plug into my firm. And I've got business cards if you'd like. But you're right. From what I've read, and I now only have access to the open source media reports that you see, I'm very concerned about how they're conducting business. It does seem to have changed quite a bit from when I was there. And if you're concerned, I think you're on the right track. And so I'm hoping by a talk like this, it gets all of us thinking about what's right and what's wrong and what's appropriate. And, you know, as you're thinking about this, there's an election coming up, hopefully. Vote.
Laura? Yeah, it's a comment and I think a question. Richard shares Balco's The Rise of the Warrior Cop is documents the militarization of police. But Balco also talks to the deep divide and conflict in America over policing style. Community policing or broken window policing. Resolving this goes to the matter of leadership. His book came about at the time when swatting entered vocabulary. Remember when the mayor's dog got killed by a SWAT team? So Balco traces SWAT to the U.S. response drugs. Balco correlates police cause deaths, about 1,000 per year through 2025, partly to militarization of police equipment and tactics.
So, full confession, I haven't read the book. I was speaking with a colleague. Is that the book that you were?
I think it is, yeah.
Okay, so I need to read that book because you brought it up and now listen to it.
Great.
So,
Repeat the name of the book, Laura.
The Rise of the Warrior Cop.
Rise of the Warrior Cop.
someone named Balco.
Balco.
So I need to read that book. Maybe we all need to read that book. So without having read the book, I can tell you that it sounds like the point of that book is not all that different from the point of my presentation. So I'm interested to read it. I'll put that on my summer reading list.
Any other questions here in the room? Let me see. Anybody here? Good. Lauren?
Steve,
Loud, or let's repeat it. Okay.
Steve asked, are there explicit rules regarding the use of lethal force by local police and or ICE personnel? Is shooting a person was only if the law enforcement person felt his or her life was in danger? Is that incorrect?
So I can say yes, there are specific rules. With regard to the police, that is going to vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And if I could phone a friend, Chief Giroux can maybe answer that with regard to Arlington County.
So the big case, the big case that dictates police use of force in this country is Graham versus Connor. And that establishes what is called the objective reasonableness standard. There's a whole, they could teach a whole multi-day class on Graham versus Connor, but that, if you want to look that up, that is the case that drives police use of force hopefully in departments legally, tactically, and from a policy standpoint. So in Arlington, we teach that case, obviously, both locally, and our recruits go through pre-academy training, several weeks, academy training, which is now about 22 weeks, post-academy training, which is another 3 to 4 weeks. And then they go through what we call FTO. That's the Field Training Officer Program, where they ride with a certified training officer on each shift. That's another 2 to 3 months. And then they're finally certified for solo patrol. They can get in the police car by themselves in their uniform and ride around and deliver policing services to the community members in Arlington County. So we have legal parameters that guide our use of force. And then we have departmental policy that guides our use of force. But I will say that our departmental policy closely mirrors what is prescribed under the law for obvious reasons. We're not going to establish a policy that would be in violation of the law. And the law already tells us what we're able to do or not do.
Thank you. And I can tell you the military has a similar program in which the military trains its military law enforcement personnel similarly. The thing, though, is that you sometimes have in the military, and particularly with the National Guard, personnel who are military but not necessarily law enforcement specialists who then get orders to do law enforcement-like duties out in the civilian community. They get what we call just-in-time training, which unfortunately is not going to be quite as extensive as what the chief just outlined. But in general, the military does have the use of force continuum I mentioned earlier. When an incident arises, you don't automatically resort to deadly force. A lesser use of force would be appropriate. You have rules on the use of force, which governs what you are and are not allowed to do. Similar and very analogous to what the civilian police.
Any other questions here in the room? Any other questions online?
One more, well, maybe more.
Or speak up. Just repeat.
Yeah, so somebody asked if, the Secretary of War, Hegseth, has purged the top leadership of the JAG Corps, and are there still JAG officers to counsel military personnel?
So that's true. The question was, has Secretary Hegseth purged the military of its top level judge advocates, attorneys in uniform? And if so, are there still people like me there to counsel commanders? So the answer is this. Yes, it's true that he fired the head military attorneys of the services and installed others whom his staff selected. There are still plenty of military JAGs, judge advocates like me, who are still in uniform, who still are trying to do their jobs. The ease with which they're able to do their jobs or the challenges that they face in doing their jobs are, I think, unique at this time in history and different than when I served. And that's the challenge right now. And it's a concern. It's a big concern. Yeah.
Remind us again what the National Guards are doing at the metro stops.
That's a great question, and I'm not entirely sure. They are there ostensibly to fight crime.
Law enforcement.
They are there ostensibly to fight crime. I don't know the reality. I have some theories, but I often ask that question when I come out of the metro as well. And I wonder I wonder somewhat about the legality. I wonder more about the approach.
Yeah.
So,
In line with that same question,
Wait for the mic, please.
in line with that same question, I mean, what authority do they have? Do they have arrest power?
so it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on what status they have. It depends on what rules they're operating under. And I don't have all that at my fingertips right now. They sometimes have arrest power themselves if they're not in federal status, they're in state status, or
We're in the federal district, and that's a whole different.
yeah, or they'll have detention power where they can detain a person and turn them over to local law enforcement. The jurisdictional issue you brought up is an interesting one. In DC, it's perhaps the most complicated multi-jurisdictional piece of land you can find. There are dozens of different jurisdictions for law enforcement within DC, between the Metropolitan Police, between various federal law enforcement agencies, the Park Police, the Capitol Police. I can go on and on and on about how many police jurisdictions there are in DC. And there's a lot of overlap. Some of it is what we call exclusive jurisdiction. Some of it's what we call concurrent jurisdiction, where more than one police force can exercise powers there. It's really complicated. So depending on if you're on this block or this block, if you cross the street, you may be walking into a different jurisdiction. It's really complicated. These things.
So if we're told to do something by a National Guardsman, what are we supposed to?
Well, depending on what they tell you, what they want you to do, generally speaking, I would say it's probably easier and safer to do the thing and then try to figure out later on if it's a problem, as opposed to not doing the thing and risking whatever happens next. I think in many ways, that's a crappy response. I get that, but I don't want to see you shot or arrested for something that might not be a big deal.
Well, but the question I really have is, they are more heavily armed and more heavily equipped than any policeman I see at the metro station.
Yeah.
And is there a legal basis they're being so heavily armed and equipped? Or does that just come when you get a military person, they come with all that stuff on them?
So, like civilian police, military personnel come with all different levels of arming, from being unarmed to being armed to the teeth, ready to invade Poland. And it's not always apparent by looking at them what level they're on, because you may not see weapons that they have on them. or you may see weapons and assume that they're armed or loaded, and they're not loaded. There's lots of variables that may not be apparent to the naked eye when you see them. So looks can be deceiving. Having said that, their commanders determine the arming level based on the authority that they're under and based on what they perceive to be the threat environment, much like police do when they're out on the street, right? And whether they're doing that correctly or not, whether they are doing that appropriately or not, I think is a fair question to ask. And so, I said earlier, there's an election vote. To that end, I think being a responsible citizen these days, civic duty means not just asking questions like this, but asking questions of the right people. So write your Congress representatives, your senators and your congressmen and ask questions like this. I think that's fair game because I think there's a lot that's what's going on today that is questionable, that is different, and we deserve answers, right? And so I would encourage that that's part of all of our civic duty. I think what you're doing here by being at an event like this is a wonderful thing. I love having conversations like this with folks and have the give and take. I learn as much as you do, if not more so. And I like to ask questions. And I think that's our right to do so as citizens. So I would encourage you to do that. You're on the right track. I don't have all the answers. And I can tell you, like I said, sometimes the arming level is not apparent just by looking. But these are great questions. Sir.
So going along with that National Guard aspect, they report to the governor. So, right. So,
and they're in state steps, they report to the governor.
Right. So my question is, a hypothetical. I mean, can the president, if he disagreed with an election outcome, nationalize the National Guard and tell them to go in and take over the state election things? Or can the governor say, we refuse that order?
So yes and no. That is a highly complicated question. On the one hand, the president can federalize the National Guard over the objections or without the consent of the state governor. And once they federalize that National Guard, those are now part of the Army and Air Force, just like the regular Army and Air Force. When you do that, when you federalize the National Guard, you now bring them onto a federal status, which means what under the Posse Comitatus Act? Talked about this before. The Posse Comitatus Act applies to federal forces. And there's another statute I didn't mention yet. And there's another statute, and that says that you're not supposed to have the military at the polling places. Now, people are debating right now what that means, because apparently it's not as cut and dry as it is in black and white in the statute. Because the term military is not really defined. I think most reasonable people would define military certainly as the federal forces. Would you also include National Guard forces under state status? That's an open question.
Or ICE.
Or ICE, which is not military, they're paramilitary, but they're definitely not military. I know what they look like, but they're not military. They're not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, for example. Okay? They're not under the military command and control. They have different training, different authorities under a different federal title. So great point and great question. The extent to which the law against military at the polling places does or does not apply to them is an open question. I think with ICE, I don't think they fall under that law. Honestly, that's my honest read of balls and strikes. It doesn't mean they should be there, but it means there's a question to be asked, and that particular law may not be the answer. In terms of the military, when they're in non-federal status, again, that's an open question, and I'm hoping that it remains an academic one, and we don't have a real question to answer come November, but I don't know. You're asking the right questions. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but you're definitely on the right track with your concerns and your questions.
Any other questions here in the room? Any other questions online? I think there are none online. I have one final question. It's a one for you to answer. What is your business and who are your clients?
Wow, I did not ask her to say that. So my business is Eagle Edge LLC. I'm the founder and principal of it. I developed it last fall. Right now it's a solo strategic advisory firm.
Say that again. It's what kind of firm?
Solo strategic advisory consulting firm. So basically I offer consulting, business services, advice in things like business continuity and resiliency, crisis leadership and management, enterprise risk management, and also governance resilience. So for example, a new client that I have is a nonprofit, which is working to try to influence some of the questions that we're asking today. And I'll be reviewing some materials for them based on the experience that I have. So I offer those kind of services.
So it's business, but it's not necessarily this subject.
No, not necessarily this. I mean, if a potential client had questions and wanted to work in this space, I can certainly advise them. But this is not really the meat and potatoes of the business.
Okay, let me get my way down here.
Thank you all very much for your attention. Thanks for coming today.
Mark, this is just great. Thank you very, very much for doing this. Also, this is recorded in case you didn't get all the fine points of this. It's recorded and it'll be on our website. Here we go. So please do look for that. Also, I mentioned a few presentations coming up. Encore Learning does a great job in communicating what's coming up. So please do join us for that. Most of those are Zoom, not necessarily hybrid. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.